All right, so the first thing we'll do is take the reading quiz. Password today, all lowercase, H2O. And when you are done taking the quiz, just close your laptop so I know when to move on. All right, looks like everybody's done with the quiz. Awesome. Update on grading exams. I have most of them graded, but not quite thoroughly yet. There's a few more I have to grade, and then for those of you that read the syllabus and sent me a picture of the sloth for an extra point, all right, I still have to add in that point. All right, so I should have that done by the end of the day today. Let's see here. Anybody watch Sesame Street growing up? Yeah. All right. Well, I have this nice video that's a good lead in to what we'll be talking about today.
I got my essay written, and I've been working on it for about a week. So now I'm going to show you how I use Grammarly to... Wow!
It's like from the 70s, so.
Here, you want to see this great plant I grew from like a tiny seed? Yeah. Oh, wait till you see this, man. It's incredible. Oh, wow. It looks funny. Oh, well, maybe it's asleep. Well, wake it up, man. All right. Hey, plant, wake up. No, I think you have to, like, get an alarm clock or something. Oh, you know what? I just remembered. My dog always wakes me up. Oh, all right. Hey, Rex, come on, boy. Come on in here. Hey, yeah, that's a good boy. Hey, Rex, how's it going? Look, wake up the plant, okay? You know, my mother says a shower always wakes her up. Well, I gotta remember that. Oh, how can I be so dumb? Plants need water, man.
So, I love that little video. Plants need water, man. All right, so that is what we will be talking about today, plants and water. All right, so why do plants need water? Well, water is a limiting resource, right? And we've seen it's very important in photosynthesis, right? Giving us those replaced electrons, giving us hydrogen ions. It's important for a lot of other cellular functions in the plant. It's important for transport, which we will see today and tomorrow, transport of sugars and nutrients throughout the plant. Can help support the plant, all right, by turgor pressure, which we will introduce in a few slides here. And then it's lost during transpiration, which you should have an idea of what transpiration is based on that video that I had you watch. It's the water being lost through the leaves, through the stomatas. All right. I put this image up here because I think it's a good representation of how water is such a limiting resource. All right. We see annual precipitation on the bottom, right? And as precipitation goes up, all right, the productivity of the plants, all right, we typically look at productivity in terms of biomass, so how much they're producing, right, also increases. All right, so rainforest definitely has more lush, has more greenery than a desert. All right, so water is definitely the limiting resource. All right, and it's water's structure and property that really makes it an ideal primary resource for plants. Right, the reason that plants use water and not some other liquid as an important part of their cellular processes. All right, so I put the properties of water up here, and we're actually going to watch a video on the properties of water because I think animation is really good to kind of help remember these properties. But in order to understand the video, right, we have to talk about the chemical bonds that water has. All right, and I am very broadly introducing these bonds to you. All right, so one of the bonds you'll be hearing talked about is a covalent bond. All right, so remember we have an atom. It has those electrons circling the nucleus. All right, when those electrons are shared by at least two other molecules here, or two other atoms, all right, such as in water, when we share those electrons, that forms a covalent bond. All right, so it essentially bonds two electrons together, or two atoms together via their electrons. All right, now in water, all right, water is a polar molecule. So what this means is when we have that bond taking place, essentially oxygen wants to hog those electrons to itself. All right, even though they're supposed to be shared, those electrons are drawn a little bit closer to the hydrogen, to the oxygen than the hydrogen. All right, so oxygen hogs those electrons, and what that does is it puts a slight charge on our two different atoms, so three atoms in our water molecule. All right, so if we look at the charge here, oxygen is hogging these electrons, so it gives it a slightly negative charge, all right, meaning that it could stand to lose some charge. That's how I remember it's negative. It could lose some. And then hydrogen gains a partial positive charge, right, because it could stand to gain a few electrons or gain some charge back, right, because a lot of that charge is lost to the oxygen. All right, so that makes it a polar molecule. Right, meaning it has a charge to the molecule. One end is negative, right? The other side is positive. Right? Those hydrogens are positive. The last thing we'll hear is hydrogen bonds. All right, so hydrogen bonds is this attractive force between hydrogen molecules, right, to another slightly charged molecule. So if we look at a bunch of water molecules in our image below, all right, we have hydrogen in white, all right, and they are attracted to other molecules that have a slight charge. Now we know water is polar, so it has a slight charge. So the positive slight charge on the hydrogen is attracted to the negative slight charge on the oxygen. And that creates a hydrogen bond. All right. Anybody have any questions on those terms? All right, so let's review the properties of water, and I think the Amoeba sisters do a really great job of just really simply explaining
Ever
this.
wondered about search? Visit YouTube to learn more about how search works.
Oh, we get 2 ads this time.
So we have a riddle for you. Okay, not really a riddle. We're bad at riddles, but more like clues about our favorite molecule. It's polar, it's shaped like an outstretched V, its properties are awesome, and it makes up 3/4 of the surface of the Earth. That one always gives it away. Our favorite molecule is water, and we're not going to lecture you about how important water is and the fact that all life as we know it could not survive without it, because, yeah, that's true. But we really want to talk about what makes water so unique for biology itself. What are some awesome properties of water? Now, we mentioned the shape of water and the fact that water is polar. It has one very electronegative oxygen that is always trying to keep the electrons closer to it than to the hydrogens it's bonded to. And this actually gives oxygen a slightly negative charge because of the electrons that are spending more time next to it, and it gives the hydrogens a slightly positive charge. Well, that means that other water molecules have an easy time bonding together. Why? Well, because the hydrogen of one water molecule with its slightly positive charge can bond to another water molecule's oxygen with that slightly negative charge. These bonds among the water molecules are hydrogen bonds, and these are the very bonds that allow water to have many of the properties that we're about to talk about. Have you ever looked at a really tall tree and wondered, how does the water get all the way up there? I mean, it's got to go against gravity. Gravity? Well, in our plant video, we talk about the xylem. It's vessels within certain types of plants, like trees, and these vessels transport water. But what's really neat about water is that it sticks to the xylem walls in what is known as adhesion, and this helps fight gravity. But water molecules, with their hydrogen bonding, they also bond to each other in something called cohesion. It's almost a beads on a string kind of fashion. Water molecules evaporate from a leaf, and then the next water molecule in line is pulled upwards, and so on. This cohesion is really a big deal. Cohesion is also a reason that water striders, one of our favorite insect types, can skate on water. Cohesion contributes to the surface tension of water. Water actually has quite a bit of surface tension compared to many other liquids. And it's not just water striders that can walk on water. There are a lot of insects, spiders, and even larger animals like reptiles and some birds that have the ability to walk on water. So, to the Google for that. Now, with water being polar, it's also a very powerful solvent for other molecules. And that means that water can dissolve many other molecules, especially polar molecules and ionic compounds. Now, why does that matter? Well, this is really important because many of the processes that occur in organisms use water as a solvent. In our body system video, we talk about the function of kidneys, and you definitely couldn't have kidneys doing their function without water. Also, a main component for body fluids is water. I'll never forget when I was little, my father built us a pond. We had some goldfish in there, and I loved this pond. Well, in West Texas, where we're from, it can freeze in the winter. And one morning, I went outside, terrified to find that the top of the pond had frozen. And I thought our fish were goners. Only to find out that they were swimming and doing their fish activities under the ice layer. It's common for many substances to actually contract when they freeze and to become more dense. But water expands when it freezes and becomes less dense in its frozen state, resulting in floating ice, where it can actually make this insulated surface layer that makes a difference for many organisms underneath. And this is due to the hydrogen bonds. See, at freezing level, the making and breaking of hydrogen bonds, which usually happens pretty often, is not happening very much when frozen. And so the molecules, they're set into this lattice of hydrogen bonded molecules, just far enough apart that it's less dense in ice form than it is in water form. And that's going to be very important for all of that aquatic life. Speaking of temperature, water resists changing its temperature. It has what's called a high specific heat. Specific heat, it's a measurement of heat that's needed to be absorbed or lost for 1 gram of a substance to change its temperature by 1 degree Celsius. And that's why on the first day that school is out in the summer, it may be super hot outside, but the water could still be pretty cool. It's really good that water's like this for life. It's stabilizing for aquatic environment temperatures. And it also means that water can absorb a lot of heat in the summer without reaching as high of a temperature itself, which is useful when winter comes along, because then the water can release heat as it cools in the winter. This also impacts the environment. Now, still on the topic of temperature, consider evaporation. Many animals rely on evaporation to cool them. Think of water molecules. They are moving, but those that have more heat energy, they're moving the fastest. And they're the more likely molecules to make the phase change to gas. And these molecules, as they leave, their energy, their heat, is no longer on your skin. And by the way, all of this is not just animals too. Plants use evaporative cooling to aid them in hot temperatures. Excessive high temperatures could be very dangerous for many different processes in both plants and animals. It can be damaging to the enzymes involved in those processes. So, that evaporative cooling is very important. Well, we went through a lot of features of water. Definitely something to consider next time you encounter it, which, based on how much we depend on water, will likely be soon. Well, that's it for the Amoeba Sisters, and we remind you to stay curious.
All right. So I like this video because it very visually gives you all those properties of water. So I'm not going to lecture on it because I think the video does a good job. All right, but I did put up those properties of waters that I would expect you to know. But the one that they did not mention was the very last one I have on my list here, that high tensile strength. They kind of alluded to it, right? But we didn't quite get there, all right? High tensile strength, we're basically looking at, why that water strider can walk on the surface of the water because of the surface tension. And that's due to this high tensile strength, right? Because water molecules like to stick together. It takes a lot of force to break them apart, right? So that gives them a really high strength due to this cohesion, all right? And I like this animation here. It takes a lot of energy to break them apart. All right, so if we were thinking about all those properties of water, all right, how might the properties of water change if water was not polar? All right, take a few minutes, kind of bounce ideas off of each other and see what we come up with.
Yes. I have a question.
Yeah.
Does water being polar have like any kind of influence of it being a good conductor for electricity?
Ooh. My initial answer would be probably, but I don't really know if that makes sense. Something I haven't looked up before. Yeah. Be more into like almost like the physics realm that I'm not familiar with.
It's okay.
Yes, that's a good question. All right, it got very quiet there. So what is a property of water, and how might it change if water was nonpolar? Yeah.
Wouldn't be such a good solvent.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a good solvent. It wouldn't be able to dissolve other solutions or other molecules. That's the word I'm looking for, as well, right? Because it's not polar. All right. What's another property of water?
It wouldn't be as cohesive.
It wouldn't be as cohesive. Yeah. So if it's not as cohesive, that means it's not going to stick together as well, right? So you've ever seen, let's see, if you've tried to fill up a glass of water, like as full as it can possibly get, and sometimes it kind of looks like it's bubbling over, right? That's a good example of cohesion, right? Those water molecules want to stick together. They do not want to break apart, right? If we didn't have cohesion, you wouldn't be able to fill up your glass that full, right? It's just going to immediately spill over the sides. All right, what about another property of water here? Any other we want to look at? All right, what about specific heat? Right? What about high specific heat? What is that? All right, that is a trickier one of the properties. All right, high specific heat means it takes a lot of energy for water to cool or to warm. Right? So think about a good example they gave was, right away in the springtime when it's nice and warm, you're like, oh, I want to jump in the pool and go for a swim. Well, that lake or that pool is still going to be probably pretty cold because it takes a long time for water to heat up, right? And again, it's due to the polarity of this water. It's due to those hydrogen molecules. We didn't have the polarity. We wouldn't have the hydrogen bonding. We wouldn't have that high specific heat, right? So I could go through the list of every single property of water here. They will all be impacted by water molecules not being polar, all right? Any questions about the properties of water? All right. So if we are talking about plants, all right, the first type of transport that we want to look at is short distance transport of water. All right. So when I'm talking about short distance, I'm talking about travel into a cell or between just a few cells, like maybe 2 or 3 cells. Right? Very, very short distances. Right? In order for this short distance travel to happen, they have to cross into the plasma membrane. Right? So remember, we have our cell here, and outside of the plasma membrane, we have this cell wall. Right? It's kind of like this mesh. Right? It's pretty easy for water to travel through the cell wall. Right? But when it gets to the plasma membrane, right, that phospholipid bilayer is what's called semi-permeable and very selective. Right? So not just everything can go through the plasma membrane. Right? It's essentially acting as a filter, right? Taking in what it wants and making sure what it doesn't want stays outside of the cell. All right? Now, water has the ability to just go right through this membrane, right? But it can also be aided by what we'll talk about in just a little bit here, these transport proteins. All right? So what I want you to take away from this slide is that plasma membrane is selective. All right? And we need to have a way for water to get across that plasma membrane. All right, so when we're talking about water transport, we're really talking about passive transport. All right, so that's the movement of water molecules from an area of high to low concentrations. All right? And in this movement, we don't need any energy input. All right? We don't need to use ATP or any of the energy currencies of the cell in order to move these molecules. All right, now if we're looking at passive transport, there's really 3 main types, all right? And water is going to go through essentially 2 of these types, right? So the first one is osmosis. So I think that video I had you watch did a pretty good job of explaining osmosis. We'll go over it again too. And then the second one would be simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion. All right, so let's start with osmosis. All right, so osmosis is the movement of water molecules against a gradient, or along a gradient, excuse me. All right, we're going from a concentration of high to low, essentially. All right, and it's dependent on the solutes in the water. All right, so if we have our sugar molecule on one side of our membrane, right, these big red molecules, and on the other side we had more sugar molecules, right? We essentially want to equalize the ratio of sugar to water molecules, right? Right now it's very uneven, right? So in order to equalize this ratio, that water is going to move to the side that has a higher solute concentration to try to equalize it out, right? So this is the process of osmosis. Now, simple diffusion, right? It's a little easier to understand. All right, this is movement of small molecules across a gradient, right? And this is where we're really looking at that high to low. All right, so if we look at our lipid bilayer here, at the very top, we have this very high concentration of, we'll say that these are water molecules. All right, and on the bottom, we have this very low concentration. All right, well, water wants to move from areas of high to low. All right, so from high to low, it's going to move from the top to the bottom until eventually it's more or less equal. All right, now just because it's equal doesn't mean movement is going to stop. All right, there still might be movement back and forth, all right, but there's no directional movement. If I had to say which way the water is moving, I would not say it's going from top to bottom. I would not say it's going from bottom to top, but it's happening a little bit in both ways. All right. The last type of transport that water can undergo, all right, is facilitated diffusion. All right, so this is a movement of essentially a large or a charged molecule across a gradient via a transport protein. All right, now we know water is a charged molecule. It can go directly through the plasma membrane, right? But that process is fairly slow, and we want to try to speed it up, right? So water takes advantage of these proteins, right, that span the length of our plasma membrane, right, and act to help move molecules faster from one side of the membrane to the other. Right, so we have a channel protein here. Is essentially always open, all right, and it's just a large pore for these molecules to go through. We also have these carrier proteins. Right, now water really doesn't use these carrier proteins, all right, but this would be a protein that would open on one side, change its shape, and then open on the other side to release the molecule. Now, when we're talking about water, we're really looking at a channel protein called aquaporin. All right, it's a very specific protein, specific to moving just water across the plasma membrane. Right, we often find these in root membranes, in the membranes of the cells in the roots, because we know the roots take up water from the soil, right? And they want to take up that water very quickly, right? So they have a lot of these aquaporins, right? So together, right, it's diffusion, but also these aquaporins that are going to help speed up the rate of water movement across a membrane. All right, so if we're looking at water movement, all right, we're talking about osmosis, all right, diffusion of free water, which means free water means that water's not attached to anything, all right? There's nothing dissolved, water's not bonded to anything else. It's free water across a semi-permeable membrane, which in this case is our lipid bilayer, right? And osmosis in the video we really that I had you watch before class, it really focused on the solute concentration. All right, but it also responds to pressure concentrations, all right? And putting those together, we can say that that is the water potential, all right? That is dictating which way water will flow. All right, so water potential, all right? That is the movement of, or the measure of free energy, of water per unit volume, and is measured in megapascals, which is this MPa. So if you see MPa behind something, right, that is megapascals, and that is the unit for water potential. All right, so essentially, the water potential has that nice definition there, but it's describing the ability of water to do something, to do work via a given volume. All right, now it's influenced by several different things. All right, in the video you watched, they focused on solute concentration. It's also influenced by pressure concentration, or pressure gradients. But it's also can be influenced by gravity. All right, now we almost ignore gravity for the most part. Gravity really does not play a role in most of the plants we're going to look at. Now, if we're looking at really tall trees, this is where gravity is going to play more of a major role. All right, so for the purpose of this class, we're just going to kind of ignore the gravity aspect. All right, so remember when we're talking about water potential, all right, it's a relative value. All right, it doesn't mean anything if I tell you that the water potential of something is negative 1.5. Right, that really has no meaning to it unless I compare it to a second water potential. Right, if I'm comparing it relative to something else, that's where we can start to infer what's going to happen with water. All right, so when we're talking about water potential, this is kind of your mantra here. Always remember, water potential, water is going to move from areas of high water potential to low water potential. All right, so that is the mantra for water potential. All right, so remember, high to low. So let's go through a few scenarios and kind of break down the water potential to understand it a little bit better. All right, so if I have this container here full of pure water, meaning it's just water molecules, there is nothing else in that water. All right, it's open, it has an open top, so it's not under any pressure. All right, and it's sitting at room temperature and at sea level. All right, so very basic, as basic as we can get. This would cause our water potential to be 0. All right, 0 megapascals, and we can see it down here. All right, now as we go forward, I'm going to drop this gravity from our water potential sign because, again, gravity is not really much of an influence for most of what we look at. All right, so part of the water potential equation is the solute potential. All right, and the symbol denoting solute potential, I believe this is the Greek letter psi subscript s. All right, that would be the solute potential. All right, that's the effect of anything dissolved in the water. All right, dissolved molecules, dissolved solutes in the water. All right, so when we're talking about plants, those dissolved solutes are going to be minerals that the plant needs. They're going to be sugars that the plant has produced. All right, basically anything that's dissolved that's not water. So if we have nothing dissolved in our water, right, nothing at all, it's just pure water, right, our solute potential is going to be 0, right, because there's no solutes in it. Right, now as we add in solutes, right, our solute potential is going to decrease, right, because those water molecules are essentially dissolving those solutes, binding to those different atoms and molecules, and that decreases the water's ability to do any other type of work. All right, so it's decreasing its ability to do other work, so we're decreasing our solute potential. So in this manner, solute potential is always going to be negative. All right, so again, we're looking at our pure water. There are no solutes in it. All right, solute potential is 0. Overall water potential is 0. Right, if we add some solutes in it, in this case we're adding in sucrose, type of sugar, right, we see that the water potential, adding up pressure of 0 and the solute potential of negative 0.244, our overall water potential is that negative 0.244 megapascals. All right, the other aspect to water potential is pressure. All right, so pressure potential is the physical pressure of a solution. All right, now this can be positive or negative depending on how pressure is playing a role. All right, so a good way to think about pressure is if you have a syringe, all right, you filled it with some sort of fluid, you stuck your finger over the end, all right, and you pull that syringe. All right, you're putting a negative pressure on that syringe because you're really trying to pull that liquid. All right, so that would be a negative pressure. Versus exactly the opposite, right? Instead of pulling, we are pushing on that solution, all right? We're exerting a positive pressure, all right? So pull, negative, push, positive, all right? So unlike the solute potential, which is always going to be negative, right? The pressure potential can be positive or negative depending if we're pulling or pushing on our solution. All right, so this is a good area to kind of talk about turgor pressure, all right, because this is a huge influence on plants as a whole. So remember, in plant cells, we have our cell wall, all right, really rigid on the outside. Inside of that, we have our plasma membrane, right? Turgor pressure is the force that plasma membrane is exerting on the cell wall. All right, so say we have a cell here, and we're increasing the volume of the cell, or adding more water into the cell, right? That causes that cell to expand, and that plasma membrane is going to start really pushing against that cell wall, right? Because remember, that cell wall is really rigid. It's not going to move, right? So the plasma membrane is pushing against it. This would increase our turgor pressure, right? And we would say that these cells are now turgid. Right, so the opposite being if these cells lost water, right? So we have our cell here. Water is being lost. Maybe we forgot to water our house plants for a week, right? And they're starting to look really sad and droopy, right? We're losing water from our cells. The plasma membrane, we can see, is really shrinking away from the cell wall, right? That cell volume is decreasing. The turgor pressure is decreasing. We would call this cell to be flaccid, all right? A flaccid cell. All right, we don't have a lot of pressure exerted up against the cell wall. All right, so taking that terminology into account here, we're going to walk through a couple scenarios to see how water flows using our water potential equation. All right, so in this image here, I have a wilted plant cell, which again it's called flaccid. All right, our flaccid plant cell is going to be dropped into our sucrose solution. All right, so our sucrose solution is that negative 0.244 megapascals. Our flaccid cell, right, the water potential inside of our cell, is a negative 0.732. Right, so when we put this cell inside of our sucrose solution, right, remember water goes from areas of high to low water potential. Right, and because this is a lot lower, negative 0.7 than negative 0.2, water is going to flow into the cell. It's going to make that cell a lot more turgid, right, increasing our turgor pressure. All right, so the opposite is true. All right, if we're taking that turgid cell, all right, we have a water potential of, water potential of 0.2 in that turgid cell. This time we're dropping it into a solution that has a water potential of negative 0.7, right? Remember, water moves from areas of high to low, right? This is a much higher value than negative 0.7. So in this case, water is going to move out of the cell, right? And that cell is going to become flaccid. All right, so this is a good example of how water potential really helps move water throughout the plant. So water potential is really important. All right, when we're looking at plants, we're really one of the key factors you might research is the water potential. All right, so at a cellular level, it'll dictate which way water is going to flow into and out of cells. All right, as a whole plant, it's going to indicate the plant water status. All right, is that plant well watered, or is that plant kind of unhealthy? It really craves some water because it's really flaccid at this point. Physiologically, right, it can really change plant functioning. So I put this image up here. All right, we have our water potential on the bottom. All right, we're getting more and more negative as we go along, up to negative 4. All right, and we have all these different functions that the plant can perform. Now notice, as we get more and more negative in our water potential, a lot of these functions tend to decrease, such as photosynthesis, cell wall synthesis, cell elongation, right? They're starting to decrease. We just don't have enough water to support those functions. Now some of these physiological changes will increase, right? So the solute accumulation, if we're losing water and leaving solutes behind, right? Those solutes are going to start to accumulate. Same with this specific acid accumulation. All right, so let's put this into practice. I have a couple of different scenarios here of a cell. All right, think about which way is water going to flow.
good. So fun.
All right, so it sounds like we've had a chance to think about this here. All right, so thinking about water potential and which way water moves. All right, is water going to move from areas of high to low or low to high water potential? High to low, yeah, it's always going to move from the higher water potential to the lower water potential. All right, so if we have our cell up there that is negative 0.364, right, and we're going to drop it into a sucrose solution of negative 0.69, right, is water going to enter or exit the cell? It's going to exit the cell. Yeah, so negative numbers can kind of throw a wrench into how we're thinking about things, all right? You kind of have to almost retrain your brain. But the higher value here is the one closer to 0, right? So the negative 0.3. The lower value, right, is the negative 0.6. We're moving from high to low. That means we're moving from water inside the cell towards outside the cell. Water is going to exit the cell. All right, so if we put this cell into a sucrose solution with a water potential of negative 0.1, which way is it going to go? It's going to go the other way. Yeah, it's going to enter the cell. Yeah. Think about high to low. All right, so if we're looking at this water potential equation, all right, which has solutes and pressure, which part of this equation is probably driving the overall water potential? It's solutes, yeah. Really, the only thing we manipulated here are the solutes. We really haven't changed much in pressure. All right, water potential. Is that making sense to everybody? All right. So keeping water potential in mind, right, because it is going to come into play, we're going to start talking about long distance transport. All right, how do we get water from the roots all the way up to the shoots? All right, so water potential plays a role, right, but there's other processes that are happening that might play more of a major role depending on where in the plant we're looking. One of the most major things that's going on in long distance transport is called bulk flow. All right, so this is the mass movement of molecules due to pressure gradients. All right, so pressure is really playing a key role in this really long distance transport. All right, it's really independent of the solute concentrations because pressure is just so much more of an influence here. All right, we're looking at our vascular cells. So remember, we're looking at the vascular bundle, which contains xylem, transporting water, phloem, transporting mostly sugars. All right, when we're talking about mostly transporting water, we're going to be focusing on the xylem. All right, and know that although we have bulk flow, right, that's really driven by pressure, right, active transport and diffusion is still happening here, right, especially in short distances. So if we need to get water into a cell, that's really going to be diffusion or passive transport. All right, but if we're talking about from the roots all the way to the shoots, that's mostly pressure driven. That is bulk flow. All right, so the driving force for whole water plant transport is transpiration. All right, so transpiration, right, that is the loss of water vapor from the stomata in the leaves of the plant. All right, water is being lost out at the very top of the plant here. Right, and again, we can look at water potential to help explain this. Right, if we look at the water potential of the air outside of a plant, it's like negative 100 megapascals. It is very, very low. It is very, very negative, very dry. Right? Whereas in our leaf air spaces, right, and in our leaves, we have a megapascal of water potential of like -1 to -7. Right? It is much higher compared to that outside air. Right? And because water moves from areas of high to low, water is going to be really pulled to go outside of the plant because that water potential of the air, negative 100, is so low. All right? So that's a driving force moving water through the plant. All right, so we're going to break this down into different parts of the plant and look specifically how this is the driving force. All right, so I highlighted some areas on our plant here that we're going to look at. All right, when we're looking at whole plant water transport, it's often called the SPAC, the soil plant air continuum, all right, because all three components play a role here. All right, if we're looking at the leaf air spaces, it's really due to the change, which is this triangle, in the concentration of water vapor. We're looking at moving water from the roots to the shoots through the xylem. It's the change in the water potential of pressure, right? Pressure potential. We're looking at just getting the water across our roots into the vascular system, into the xylem. It's going to be a change in overall water potential. And then getting the water from the soil up to be close to those roots is going to be a change in pressure. All right, so we're going to go through this, and we're going to start at the very bottom of this continuum here by looking at the soils. All right, so if we have our soils here, all right, we see all these different soil particles. There are spaces in between, and the water is kind of concentrated around all of these different particles. All right, what's driving water towards our roots, all right, is a pressure potential. Right? The roots, they're taking up water, which is essentially pulling the water towards the roots. All right? So if we're pulling the water towards the roots, we have pressure potential playing a role. Right? It's creating a gradient and causing water to move. Right? This can also be considered bulk flow, right? Because pressure is the main driver here. Right? Pressure is pulling water towards the roots. All right, now once it gets to the roots, it has to enter the roots. All right, so we really need good root-soil contact for water uptake. This is why roots are often very much branching, taking up a lot of surface area. Those root hairs playing a huge role. All right, but water is mostly going to enter the root at the root tip. Right? The reason being is a lot of those older parts of the roots, right? They've already explored those areas. They probably used up a lot of resources in those areas already. They're going to become superized, which basically means they're going to get hard, tough, waxy. All right, really not feasible for water to enter into those roots. All right, think of them as becoming old, waxy. All right, so these root tips are really the areas where water is going to enter. All right, so if we look at distance from our root tip, as we increase the distance from the root tip, all right, the rate of water uptake also decreases, right? Whereas that growing tip, we have a lot of water uptake. All right, so water has reached these growing tips of the roots, right? Now we got to get water into the root, right? And this is due to water potential, the overall equation, solutes and pressure playing a role here. All right, so water is going to enter into the root. All right, it has to cross this epidermal layer, all right, due to differences in water potential. All right, remember, high to low. Once it gets inside of the root, it also has to cross all of these cells in order to get to our vascular bundle, in order to get to that xylem. All right, and it's going to do so in the same way due to the differences in water potential. All right, so if I was looking at the differences in water potential, and I knew that water was coming into the root, is the water potential in the roots going to be higher or lower than in the soils? Lower, yeah, because we're going from high to low, yeah. So as we're going towards the center of the root, water potential becomes more and more negative, which is drawing the water into our xylem. All right, so at this point we've reached to the xylem. We've reached the vascular bundle in the center of our roots. All right, and this is where we're going to start seeing bulk flow. So remember, the xylem is made of these two different types of cells. These vessel elements, which are kind of short and wide, and these tracheids, which are very thin and long. All right, so bulk flow, we know, is a difference in pressure. So how is that pressure created? All right, we have to think back to our properties of water at this point. All right, we know that water is being lost at the leaf surface via transpiration. Right? And we also know that water has these properties of being very cohesive. Right? So this is where we get the cohesive tension theory. Right? Because water is being lost to the leaves, but water likes to stick to each other, essentially there's this steady pull of water up the entire plant. All right? So water molecules sticking to one another and pulling each other up the plant until it reaches the leaves, becomes vapor, and exits. All right? So cohesion tension theory. We're looking at the properties of water, and we're really looking at transpiration causing that tension, right? Pulling it up. All right, so if we're pulling water up the xylem, is this movement due to positive or negative pressure? Negative, yeah, we're pulling. Pull is negative. If we were pushing, that would be positive. All right, so we're pulling the water up through the xylem. All right, so how exactly is this tension created? Right? How does the water leave the leaves? All right, well, we know that the air is much drier than the leaves, right? Much drastically drier than the leaves. And this causes evaporation from the stomata. All right, so if we look at our leaf section here, we have our pores. All right, these are our stomata. This is where the water vapor is going to exit through. All right, if we look even closer, all right, inside the stomata, we typically have these pits, all right, of these cells surrounding our stomata. And if we look at those cells, there tends to be a thin, very, very thin layer of water surrounding these cells. All right. Now, because the air is so much drier, all right, this water is going to become gas, become water vapor, and leave through the stomata. Right. So it takes a lot of pressure. Maybe not pressure is not the right word. Pressure in a colloquial way. A lot of influence, all right, for that water to become gas, right? Because it really likes to stick to each other. It does not like to separate, all right? So in order to separate, that takes a lot of force on the water's part to become water vapor, right? But because the air is so much drier, it is going to become water vapor and exit through the stomata and evaporate. All right, so in this way, all right, through a different image of how you can look at this here, all right, we have water vapor content higher in the leaves than outside the leaves. All right, we're moving from high to low. Water vapor is going to exit. All right, it's exiting because the outside air is really, really dry. All right, evaporation is increased. And what drives this is the sun. All right, the sun is heating up the air. It's causing evaporation to occur. So we can think of water transport in plants as being solar powered. All right, it's a driving force causing the water to leave the leaves. All right, so we have water leaving the leaves. All right, if water just constantly exited, right, that plant's going to go through water pretty fast. Right, so plants have to have a way to regulate their water loss. Right, and this happens in a couple of different ways. All right, one is boundary layer resistance. All right, so the boundary layer is if we have our leaf, all right, and maybe this might make more sense to try to draw it out here. All right, we have the top part of our leaf here. Let's say this is the cuticle. We have our layer of epidermal cells. All right, we're actually going to have, and maybe we'll put some stomata in here, these pores. We're going to have this very, very thin layer of air, unstirred air, undisturbed air, right above the leaf. All right? So this unstirred air, right, has a higher concentration of water vapor than the outside air. All right? Because outside air is constantly being whisked away by other factors such as wind. But this layer of unstirred air is a little higher in water vapor content. All right? Because it's a little higher than that outside air, right, the water's not going to leave the stomata as fast. Right? Because instead of having, say, a concentration of negative 100 megapascals, And maybe immediately inside our stomata here is maybe -1 megapascals. Instead of having that huge gradient that's really going to drive the water out, we have an in-between gradient. All right, so off the top of my head, I'm not sure what the water potential of the boundary layer is. Let's just say, for the sake of this class, it's going to be 25, right? It's somewhere in between. That gradient is not as huge, right? So it's going to cause water to leave at a much slower rate. All right, so that is the boundary layer resistance. The other type of resistance is just stomatal resistance. All right, how open and closed are our stomata? All right, so boundary layer resistance, that layer of unstirred air, all right, can have a lot of things that influence it. All right, so leaf size. If you have larger leaves, you're going to have a larger boundary layer, right? So that boundary layer is going to be a little thicker on the top of the leaf. Leaf morphology can influence this. So if you see leaves that are very hairy, maybe they have a lot of trichomes coming out, right? That's really good for trapping in air, right? Creating an even larger boundary layer. And then wind speed, right? If you have a really, really windy day, right, that's going to cause this boundary layer to shrink because it's constantly being whisked away by the wind. Versus if you have a very calm day, that boundary layer can increase a bit. Right? So there's going to be different ways that this boundary layer is increased or decreased, which is going to influence the rate of water loss in leaves. All right, we also have that stomatal resistance, which I think is a lot easier to understand because it's simply how open and closed are these stomata. All right, plants have biological control over this. Right? If they sense the air being too warm or too dry, they can close their stomata to try to limit the amount of water coming out. And if they're closing the stomata, they're increasing the resistance to transpiration. Transpiration just can't occur as much, right? Versus if they're wide open. All right, that's a lot of information. All right, so in summary, right, transpiration, I keep wanting to say transportation. We are talking about transport, all right, but transpiration is what is driving water movement, all right, that loss of water from the leaves. But if we break it down and look at different sections of our plant, we can see that specifically in the leaves, it's going to be the concentration of water vapor. Specifically in the xylem, it's going to be the differences in pressure potential. Specifically in the root, it's going to be overall water potential, and specifically in the soil, drawing the water towards those root cells, it's going to be pressure potential. All right, so when studying for the exam, I think it's easy to kind of break it down in different parts and then look at it as the whole. So one thing I wanted to add is gas exchange studies. All right, we can actually look at the rates of transpiration. All right, and this is one of the things I did for my graduate studies. All right, I went to California and I looked at the transpiration rate of these plants that grew in very arid climates with very little nutrients to see, how do they do it? All right, so basically we can use a machine. All right, this is it's called a Lycor. All right, this machine has this capsule, all right, that we can clamp onto a plant. Right, and inside of this capsule, we can monitor the amounts of carbon dioxide and oxygen, but also how humid it is inside of that chamber. Right, and in this way, we can infer a lot of different things about our plants. We can look at how much it's photosynthesizing, how much transpiration is occurring, what time of the day plants are active. Right, so some plants are more active in the morning versus the night. Some plants are even more active at night. Right? We can look at the stress level of a plant and the water use efficiency. Right? So the water use efficiency is basically how efficient is the ratio of a simulated CO2, so the amount of carbon dioxide we've taken in with photosynthesis and fixed it to our molecules, to the amount of lost water. Right? So how efficient is this? And this helps us understand how well the plant is taking in carbon to make sugars. Right, so in general, right, plants lose 500 molecules of water for every 1 molecule of CO2 fixed. Right, so it doesn't seem very efficient, and it's really not. All right, we know that that's such a driving force for water to leave the plants because the air is so dry. All right. Now, this is in general. Some plants have found ways to make that more efficient. Right? Some plants, they don't have to worry about this. They live in a climate that's pretty wet. They can be less efficient. Right? But that's quite a lot of water loss for just one molecule of CO2. All right, so I'm going to give you the homework. We're going to take a break, and then we'll come back and learn how to read a scientific paper. All right, there are 3 videos on here. One of them is only like a minute long. All right, so that'll be the homework for the quiz tomorrow. The scientific paper assignment that I will give you after we take a break here, that'll be due tomorrow. And then keep in mind, another exam on Monday. All right, Friday will be a study day as well as a little bit of new material. And a discussion of endurance is once again next Tuesday. All right, this time it's chapters 6 through 13. Which sounds like a lot, but in the bulk of things, it's relatively the same as what you read before. All right, let's take a 15-minute break here. That was a lot of talking. So let's meet back here at 11:50.